So why do we create ineffective coping mechanisms? So in a video a few days ago, I was discussing about ineffective coping mechanisms that we create to manage stress, right? And I went through the 8 different coping mechanisms that we might use that are ineffective to manage our stress. But today I really wanted to look at why. Like, how does it even come about? Like, why do we create ineffective coping mechanisms when it comes to stress? And I think it's really important that we understand the why. We don't want to use it as an excuse. We don't want to sit there and say, oh, well, I can't cope with my stress because of this reason. No, what it can do is it brings that self-awareness to allow us to understand how we've created it, and it gives us the foundation to know what we can do moving forward. Before we get started, let's have a little bit of a look at when we create our coping mechanisms, because that's really important. A lot of the times when we're looking at coping mechanisms for stress, we're looking at our childhood, right? We're looking at situations within our childhood that create a space for us to either create really effective coping mechanisms or ineffective coping mechanisms, right? So it really does come back down to childhood or situations that we're put in where we have to create a coping mechanism, right? So there's some of the things to really think about when we create these coping mechanisms. So let's look at the first reason why we create ineffective coping mechanisms. The first one is we have a lack of role models, right? If we don't have the people around us that actually model good reactions towards stress, whether that's our parents, whether that's our grandparents, whether that's our teachers, whether that's people just within our community, right? If we don't have those role models, it's going to be really difficult for us to be able to understand what is an effective coping mechanism and what's not an effective coping mechanism. So some things that you can really think about is thinking about your coping mechanisms and thinking about some of the people that might have the same coping mechanisms as you that you do, and maybe you learned that from them. The second reason why we can create ineffective coping mechanisms can be because of culture and societal norms. Now, something that how I grew up and what I heard a lot was, especially within society, is that stress is a part of everyday life. You've just got to get over it. It is what it is, right? So my perceptions towards stress was it's just there. It's just always going to be there. I don't have to do anything about it because it's just going to keep happening to me. I just got to, sort of power through it. And there was really no way to find those coping mechanisms, right? And this can really happen with just in the society as well as within your culture. What really happens when we're kids, especially when we're growing up with our families or in our culture, whatever it is, or within the society, the generations that we grew up with, it actually develops our perception towards stress. And do not get me wrong, perception is really, really important and it's really, really powerful. However, our perception towards stress will actually create our reality, right? So if we have a skewed perception of stress because of whatever has happened, the way we grew up, our culture, society, whatever it is, it's going to develop how we, it's going to create a situation on how we then decide to manage stress. The third reason can be a lack of resources, right? If you don't have enough resources, whether you are a teenager or an adult, it's definitely different when you're a kid. If you don't have the right resources to actually find better ways to cope with your stress, it's going to be really difficult for you to create really healthy and effective coping mechanisms towards stress. We absolutely do need resources. We need to be taught what stress is. We need to know how it feels. We need to know what we can do about it and what's a reasonable response to it, right? And if we don't have access to those resources or those specialties, and these resources can come in the form of, education, it can be in the form of mental health guidance, counseling, whatever it is, right? If we just have a lack of those resources, it's going to be really, really challenging for us to actually create effective coping mechanisms, especially if we haven't been given the opportunity to create that self-awareness that maybe our responses to stress are really ineffective. And the fourth reason, instant gratification. So obviously we've all probably heard of instant gratification when it comes from like social media and going to the gym and whatever it is, right? We all want that instant gratification. We all want to feel great right now. However, creating effective coping mechanisms takes time. The other thing is as well, if you've created ineffective coping mechanisms, which we discussed in our previous video, we have to unlearn that and we have to create new ones. And it takes time. It takes consistent self-awareness, consistently checking in with ourselves. And essentially, as human beings, we're busy. We've got things to do. We need to sort of get from point A to point B in a really quick way. So we need that instant gratification. So we want to make sure that we're feeling good. And that's why it's really easy to fall into those ineffective coping mechanisms, it's easier to avoid than having to deal with a problem, right? It's easier to point the blame on somebody else than actually taking responsibility and accountability for ourselves or for a situation, right? It takes huge amounts of effort to really recognize these things and start to break them apart and rebuild good, effective coping mechanisms. So there are some of the reasons why we create ineffective coping mechanisms, right? If we don't have the right role models, if our culture and our society doesn't create us to look at stress and change our perception towards stress, it's going to keep us frozen in time, and it's going to allow us to create these ineffective coping mechanisms. If we don't have access to resources, we don't know what we don't know, right? So you have to be able to understand what you don't know so you can create those effective coping mechanisms. And then again, we want to make sure that we're, in instant gratification, right? I want to feel good right now. So what are some of the ways we can do that? So there's some of the reasons why we create ineffective coping mechanisms, and we have to become super self-aware of them and understand that although we have to understand why. So for instance, maybe you grew up in a really toxic family, grew up with toxic parents, whatever it is, right? If we're really aware of that, we might be actually a little bit more aware that we might have ineffective coping mechanisms. We don't want to use that situation as an excuse to behave badly or to engage in ineffective coping mechanisms, but it can be a really good understanding of why you've developed them, and it can actually give you the courage and the spur to actually start creating more effective coping mechanisms. All right. So if you want a little bit more information, please reach out to me. If you want to check out our community, so we've got the Get Your Shit Together community, where every single month we do a webinar. Every single week we do a group coaching call. We've got a really engaged community. We've got additional resources to help you manage stress and on a variety of other, topics as well. So please join that. That's on the link below. If you just want to know how stress is impacting you, please take our burnout score. It's going to let you know if you are on the road to burnout and some of the things that you can do about it. And then, of course, if you want to just reach out, have a bit more of a chat with me, please just reach out. I'm always happy to have that conversation.